There is a staff, iron-shod at its tip, its shaft polished smooth by one man's grip over more than 30 years. It stands in the corner of a chamber the way any ordinary object stands in any ordinary room, leaning, patient, unremarkable to anyone who does not know its owner. You could pass it 100 times and think nothing of it. A walking aid, a traveling prop, a pilgrim's staff, carried by a man who called himself a sinner even as he called himself a Tsar. Its owner is Ivan Vasilievich, the fourth of that name to rule Moscow, the first man in the history of his land to be crowned not merely a grand prince but a Tsar, a word borrowed from the Roman title of Caesar, a word meant to place him among emperors rather than mere princes. By November of 1581, he has worn that title for 34 years. He has expanded his realm eastward past the Volga, broken the last remnants of the old Mongol Khanates that once humbled his ancestors, rewritten the laws of his kingdom, and built a private army of black-robed riders who answer to no one but him. He has also buried more wives than most men marry, executed advisors who once raised him from a frightened boy into a monarch, and watched entire cities burn on his own order. You will come to know all of that. But tonight, in the wooden palace of Aleksandrov Sloboda, a fortified retreat some 60 miles from Moscow that Ivan has made his second capital and his fortress of the mind, none of it matters as much as what is happening in one room, between one father and one son. The son is also named Ivan. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, 27 years old, the heir raised since infancy to inherit everything his father has built and broken. For most of his life, this younger Ivan has stood closer to his father than any other living person, closer than any wife, closer than any advisor, closer than the priests who hear the Tsar's endless confessions. He has ridden beside his father on campaign. He has watched, and by some accounts taken part in, the punishments his father ordered against those who displeased him. He has been shaped, deliberately and thoroughly, into a mirror of the man who made him. Tonight, that mirror will crack. What passes between them in this room will not be witnessed by history in any complete or reliable form. There is no transcript, no eyewitness account agreed upon in every detail, only fragments, a chronicler's later summary, a foreign ambassador's second-hand report, the recollections of servants who heard raised voices through a heavy door and chose, wisely, not to look inside. What survives is an outcome, a son struck by his father, a wound that will not heal, and a kingdom that will spend the next 30 years absorbing the consequences of a few seconds inside a room in Aleksandrov Sloboda. Outside, beyond the walls of Aleksandrov Sloboda, November has already stripped the birch forests bare and frozen the rivers that thread through the countryside around Moscow. It is the season when the court traditionally retreats indoors, when firelight and candle smoke fill every chamber of a wooden palace built to hold heat against a cold that can kill an exposed traveler within hours. It is not a season associated, in the calendar of any court, with catastrophe. And yet it is precisely in this ordinary, unremarkable stretch of the year that the event which will define the end of a dynasty is about to unfold. You are not here to watch the blow itself. That moment, when it comes, will be given to you the way it was given to the servants outside that door, as sound, as silence, as the terrible space between one heartbeat and the next. This is not a story that needs its violence painted in exact detail to make its point. Its point is older and larger than any single instant of rage. It is the story of how a boy who was orphaned onto a throne, terrorized in his own childhood, and taught by every hand that touched him that power answers only to itself, grew into the very thing that had once frightened him, and how that inheritance of fear traveled, unbroken, from the men who raised Ivan the Terrible to the son Ivan the Terrible raised in turn. To understand the room in Aleksandrov Sloboda, you must first go back nearly 50 years, to a much smaller room where a 3-year-old child is told that his father is dead and that the throne of Moscow is now, in name if not yet in fact, his own. Consider, too, the shape of the land this child would one day rule. 16th century Muscovy was a realm of vast forests and short growing seasons, its villages built almost entirely of timber, its capital a wooden city that would burn to the ground more than once in the span of a single reign. It was a land still living in the long shadow of the Mongol conquest 3 centuries earlier, a memory kept alive in tribute records and the layout of its roads, and in the wary relationship its princes maintained with the Tatar Khanates that lingered at its borders. It was also a land where the Orthodox Church reached into nearly every corner of daily life, where a ruler's legitimacy rested as much on religious sanction as on force of arms, and where the idea of the Tsar as God's anointed instrument on earth was not empty rhetoric but a genuinely held belief, shared by ruler and ruled alike, that would shape every decision Ivan made and every justification he offered for what he did. Let the staff wait in its corner a little longer. There is a childhood to walk through first. Ivan Vasilievich was born in August of 1530 in the village of Kolomenskoye outside Moscow to Grand Prince Vasily III and his second wife, Elena Glinskaya. His birth was, by the accounts of the court chroniclers, greeted as something close to a miracle. Vasily had divorced his first wife after 2 decades of childless marriage, an act that scandalized the Orthodox clergy of his time, precisely because he needed an heir the realm could not survive without. Elena gave him 2 sons. Ivan was the first, and for 3 short years, he was simply a child, swaddled, blessed, paraded before foreign envoys as proof that the ruling house of Moscow would continue. Then, in December of 1533, Vasily III died of an infection that began, according to the record, as a small abscess on his leg and spread until no physician of the era could stop it. Ivan was 3 years old. He was, from that day, Grand Prince of Moscow in title. In practice, he was a child surrounded by adults who understood that whoever controlled him controlled the realm. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent for 5 years, and did so with more skill than her enemies expected of her. She stabilized the currency through a monetary reform that standardized the coinage across the realm, continued fortifying the borders, including the construction of new stone walls around the growing merchant quarter of Moscow known as Kitgorod, and held the fractious boyar families in a rough balance, playing rival clans against one another with a shrewdness that surprised courtiers who had expected a foreign-born widow to be easily sidelined. Her own family, the Glinskys, were themselves relative newcomers to Moscow's aristocracy, having arrived from Lithuania only a generation or 2 earlier, a fact that made her regency doubly precarious. She ruled not only as a woman in a deeply patriarchal court, but as the head of a family the older boyar houses regarded as upstarts with no ancestral right to influence at all. Then, in 1538, she too died suddenly, at only 30 years old. The court whispered of poison from the moment her body was laid out, and centuries later, when Soviet-era researchers examined her remains, they found mercury levels far beyond what any natural exposure of the time could explain. Some historians now treat her poisoning as close to confirmed, others urge caution, noting that mercury compounds were also used medicinally in the 16th century, in ointments and remedies that could account for at least some of what modern chemistry detects. What is certain is that Ivan, now 8 years old, was without either parent, and the men who took control of his upbringing were not inclined toward gentleness. The years that followed are the ones Ivan himself, decades later, would describe in searing terms in his own letters, and while a grown man's account of his childhood grievances should always be read with some caution, since embittered rulers are rarely impartial narrators of their own suffering, the broad shape of what he describes is corroborated by other sources of the period. The great boyar clans, chiefly the Shuiskis and later the Belskis, seized control of the Regency Council and treated the young Grand Prince less as a sovereign to be trained and more as an inconvenience to be tolerated. Ivan later wrote that he and his younger brother, who was deaf and intellectually disabled from birth, were left without adequate food or clothing, while the boyars looted the treasury and staged their power struggles in front of him, sometimes literally over his head, in the very chambers where he sat. One incident Ivan recorded stayed with him for the rest of his life. The boyar Andrei Shuiski, in a fit of contempt for the boy Grand Prince, reportedly draped himself across Ivan's own bed in the middle of the palace, feet up, as an open display of who truly held power in Moscow. Whether every detail of that scene is precisely accurate or slightly embellished in the retelling, the underlying reality it captures is not in serious dispute among historians. The boy who would become Tsar spent his formative years watching grown men treat authority as something to be seized by whoever was strongest, with no particular respect for the rightful heir standing in the room. The rivalry between the great boyar houses during these years deserves some attention of its own, because it shaped the political instincts Ivan would carry for the rest of his life. The Shuiski family, who controlled the Regency Council for much of Ivan's early childhood, were themselves eventually displaced by the rival Belsky clan in a palace struggle that involved arrests, exiles, and at least one assassination carried out, according to the chronicles, within earshot of the young Grand Prince. Metropolitan Makarii, the head of the church during much of this period, appears to have been one of the few adults who showed the boy any consistent kindness or intellectual encouragement, and it was likely through Makarii's influence that Ivan developed the genuine, lifelong interest in scripture, chronicle history, and Byzantine imperial theory that would later inform both his coronation as Tsar and the theological arguments he would deploy, years afterward, in his letters to Kurbsky. Makarii would go on, later in Ivan's reign, to preside over the church councils that formalized much of Russian ecclesiastical practice for generations and to oversee the compilation of vast chronicle collections intended to place Muscovy's rulers within a continuous sacred history stretching back through Byzantium to biblical antiquity, an intellectual project that mirrored, on the page, the same claim to inherited imperial legitimacy that Ivan's coronation would soon assert in ceremony. It is one of the stranger truths of Ivan's life that the same court which taught him, through years of neglect and casual cruelty, that power was worth nothing unless seized and defended without mercy, also produced a churchman who gave him the intellectual tools to justify that lesson in the language of divine right. Later chroniclers and even some of Ivan's own admirers passed down darker stories from these years, that the young Grand Prince, deprived of any real power over the adults around him, turned his frustration onto smaller creatures, torturing animals, and, as he grew into his teens, allegedly encouraging or permitting cruelty against palace servants and even throwing small animals from the towers of the Kremlin for sport. These stories come primarily from the writings of Andrei Kurbsky, a nobleman and former friend of Ivan's who later defected to Lithuania and became one of history's most hostile witnesses against him, which does not make the stories false, but does mean they should be weighed as the testimony of a man with every reason to paint the darkest possible portrait of the king he had abandoned and betrayed. What is beyond real dispute is the environment itself, a child ruler surrounded by adults who modeled violence, humiliation, and the naked exercise of power as the only currency that mattered, in a court where affection and stability were in desperately short supply. By the time Ivan reached his teenage years, he had absorbed a lesson that would shape every decade of his reign that followed. That authority which is not seized and defended ruthlessly will be taken from you by someone else who is willing to be more ruthless still. He had also, by most surviving descriptions, developed a volatile temperament, capable of genuine warmth and even scholarly curiosity, since he would grow into one of the more literate and theologically engaged rulers Moscow ever produced, but equally capable of explosive rage when he felt his authority questioned or his dignity mocked. The physical world Ivan grew up in reinforced these lessons at every turn. The Kremlin of his childhood was already a formidable complex of stone cathedrals and brick walls, rebuilt a generation earlier by Italian architects brought to Moscow specifically for their expertise. But the palace apartments where the young Grand Prince actually lived remained largely wooden, drafty, and, in the political sense, porous, filled with servants, minor officials, and boyar retainers who moved through the corridors freely enough to make genuine privacy for a child ruler nearly impossible. Whatever Ivan said, however he behaved, however he was treated by the men who controlled his household, there was almost always someone else present to see it, a condition that likely taught him early that composure and concealment were forms of survival in their own right, long before he learned to wield fear as a tool of rule rather than merely enduring it as a child. Beyond the walls of the Kremlin, the ordinary life of Ivan's realm continued largely untouched by the intrigues consuming the Regency Council, though it was a life shaped by hardship of its own kind. The great majority of the population worked the land as peasants, bound by custom rather than yet by the full force of law to the estates of their landlords, living through short growing seasons and long winters in single-room timber houses heated by clay stoves that also served, in many households, as sleeping platforms against the cold. Orthodox feast days structured the rhythm of the year for peasant and noble alike, and the church's calendar of fasting and celebration touched every level of society, from the grandest boyar household down to the smallest village. It was into this broader world, one where authority flowed downward from Moscow through a chain of provincial governors, church hierarchy, and landowning nobility, and where the vast majority of the population had no direct experience of the court intrigues shaping their distant ruler's childhood, that the boy Ivan would eventually project his own transformed understanding of what it meant to rule. It was against this backdrop that, in January of 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan did something no ruler of Moscow had done before him. He decided he would not simply inherit the title of Grand Prince. He would be crowned Tsar. The word Tsar derives from Caesar, and its adoption was not a small act of ceremonial vanity. For generations, the rulers of Moscow had held the title of Grand Prince, a title that placed them, at least in the formal language of diplomacy, on a tier below the emperors of Byzantium and the Khans who had once demanded tribute from Russian lands. By claiming the title of Tsar, the 16-year-old Ivan was making a deliberate statement that Moscow was no longer a subordinate principality answering to greater powers, but the inheritor of an imperial tradition stretching back through Byzantium to Rome itself. The coronation, held in the Cathedral of the Dormition inside the Moscow Kremlin in January 1547, followed rites adapted from Byzantine imperial ceremony. Ivan was anointed with holy oil, crowned with the cap of monomac, a bejeweled, fur-trimmed crown that court tradition, likely more legend than fact, claimed had been sent from Constantinople generations earlier, and presented to the assembled nobility and clergy as Tsar of all the Russias. The ceremony drew deliberately on a broader idea that had been circulating among Russian churchmen for decades, that Moscow, following the fall of Constantinople to Ottoman conquest in 1453, had inherited the mantle of the Orthodox Christian Empire, becoming, in the phrase associated with the monk Philophiae of Pskov, a third Rome, destined to endure where the First Rome and the Byzantine Second Rome had each in turn fallen. Ivan's coronation as Tsar was, in this light, not merely a personal title upgrade but a claim that Moscow now stood as the last and permanent seat of Christian imperial authority on earth. A claim that gave Ivan's later insistence on his own absolute, God-granted power a theological foundation reaching back centuries before his birth. Foreign courts took note. Ambassadors began referring to him, in their own languages, with titles reserved elsewhere for emperors and kings, rather than the lesser term prince that had applied to his predecessors, though full recognition of the Tsar's title by other European powers came slowly and unevenly, with the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy withholding full acknowledgement for years, wary of elevating a ruler of the Orthodox Church to equal standing with the Catholic emperors of the West. Weeks after his coronation, Ivan married. His bride was Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina, a young noblewoman from a family that would, generations later and under a different branch, give Russia its next ruling dynasty after the one Ivan represented came to its end. The selection of Anastasia followed a custom peculiar to the Muscovite court of this era, rather than negotiating a foreign dynastic match, as many European monarchs of the period did. Ivan's advisors arranged a bride show, gathering eligible young noblewomen from across the realm so the young ruler could choose among them directly. Some historians view this practice as a deliberate strategy on the part of the boyar establishment, intended to bind the new Tsar's household to a domestic family with no independent power base large enough to threaten the throne, rather than to a foreign court whose interests might diverge from Moscow's own. By nearly every account that survives from this period, accounts written both by Russians loyal to Ivan and by foreign visitors with no particular reason to flatter him, the marriage was a genuinely happy one. And Anastasia's calm, pious temperament appears to have had a steadying effect on her young husband's volatile nature. For the 13 years of their marriage, Ivan ruled with more restraint and more evident concern for the counsel of others than at almost any other point in his 60-year life. That restraint was tested almost immediately. In June of 1547, a catastrophic fire swept through Moscow, destroying enormous sections of the wooden city and killing, by some estimates, several thousand people. In the panic and grief that followed, rumors spread that the fire had been caused by sorcery, and specifically that Ivan's own maternal relatives, the Glinsky family, had used witchcraft to summon the flames. A mob, whipped into fury by these rumors and by long-simmering resentment of the Glinskys' influence at court, murdered one of Ivan's uncles inside the Kremlin's own cathedral of the Dormition, the same building where Ivan had been crowned only months before, and then marched on Ivan's own residence at Vorobyovo, demanding that he surrender the rest of his mother's family to their vengeance. It was, by any measure, a moment that could have destroyed the young Tsar's authority entirely, or driven him toward the same paranoid brutality that would come to define his later reign. Instead, according to the chronicles, Ivan faced the crowd, negotiated, and survived the crisis without immediate large-scale bloodshed, though several Glinsky family members and associates were killed in the unrest before order was restored. The episode appears to have frightened Ivan badly, and in its aftermath he drew close to a circle of advisors who would come to be known, somewhat romantically, as the Chosen Council, the priest Sylvester, credited with enormous moral influence over the young Tsar in these years, and the nobleman Alexei Adashev, a capable administrator who would help drive the reforms of the following decade. For a time, it seemed the fire of 1547 had burned away Ivan's worst instincts rather than inflaming them. The years immediately following his coronation would become, in retrospect, the most constructive period of his entire reign, a stretch of genuine reform, military success, and institutional growth that historians across the political spectrum tend to credit as real achievements, whatever verdict they render on the man's later decades. It is a period that deserves its own moment of pause before the story turns darker, because the Ivan who ordered the massacres of the 1560s and 1570s was not always the man he would become. For roughly a decade, he was something closer to a capable, ambitious reformer, guided by good advisors and a happy marriage, building a state that would outlast him by centuries. It was also during this decade that Ivan's court first opened sustained contact with Western Europe through an unexpected channel. In 1553, an English expedition led by the navigator Richard Chancellor, searching for a northern sea route to China, was blown off course and landed instead on the shores of the White Sea, from where Chancellor made his way overland to Moscow and was received by Ivan himself. The encounter led to the founding of the Muscovy Company, an English trading enterprise granted extensive privileges by Ivan in exchange for access to English goods, shipbuilding expertise, and diplomatic correspondence that would, in later years, include an unusually personal exchange of letters between Ivan and Queen Elizabeth I of England, in which the Tsar at one point proposed the possibility of marriage and, when the proposal was met with polite evasion, wrote back in terms sharp enough to suggest wounded pride as much as genuine romantic interest. These early contacts with England gave Moscow a trading and diplomatic relationship independent of the Baltic ports controlled by Poland, Lithuania, and the Hanseatic cities, a strategic asset Ivan valued highly throughout his reign, particularly once the Livonian War made access to the Baltic itself a matter of prolonged and costly military struggle. In 1549, Ivan convened the first Zemsky Sobor in Russian history, an assembly of nobles, clergy, and representatives of various estates, called together to discuss the reform of the law and the governance of the realm. It was not a parliament in the sense that word would later carry in Western Europe. The Tsar retained ultimate authority, and the assembly's role was advisory rather than legislative in any binding sense. But its very existence marked a departure from pure autocratic decree, an acknowledgement that even a Tsar benefited from consultation with the wider political nation of his realm, at least on matters of law and taxation. The following year, in 1550, Ivan issued a new law code, the Sudebnik, which updated and expanded an earlier code from his grandfather's reign. The new code standardized court procedures across the realm, introduced harsher penalties for corrupt officials, a notable irony, given how thoroughly Ivan's own later reign would come to rely on terror rather than law, and took early steps toward regulating the movement of peasants between estates, a set of provisions that would, over subsequent reigns, harden into the institution of serfdom that would bind Russian peasants to the land for centuries. Whether Ivan himself intended his reforms to lay groundwork for that later system, or whether the process unfolded gradually through the decisions of rulers who came after him, remains a matter some historians debate, but the seeds of it are visible in the legal architecture that began taking shape under his rule. Ivan also reorganized his military. The Sudebnik and associated reforms of this period established the Streltsy, a standing corps of professional infantry equipped with matchlock firearms known as pistols, organized into regiments that trained together year-round rather than assembling only for a single campaign season, distinct from the traditional cavalry levies drawn from the noble estates, whose service obligations were themselves formalized during this period through a new system tying military duty directly to the size of a nobleman's landholding. This was, for its time, a genuinely modern military institution, and it gave Ivan a disciplined, centrally controlled fighting force that did not depend entirely on the goodwill of the boyar families who had made his childhood so precarious. The Streltsy would remain a fixture of Russian military life for well over a century after Ivan's death, eventually becoming, in a twist their founder could scarcely have anticipated, a political faction in their own right, powerful enough to intervene directly in the succession disputes of later reigns. That force proved its worth in 1552, when Ivan led a campaign against the Khanate of Kazan, a Tatar successor state to the old Golden Horde that had long raided Russian territory and held Russian captives for ransom or slavery. The siege of Kazan was a major undertaking, involving an army numbering well over 100,000 men by some estimates, an extraordinary logistical achievement for the period given the distances involved and the need to supply such a force deep in what was, for Moscow, hostile territory. Ivan's engineers, working alongside foreign specialists including an English gunner and technicians with experience in Western siege warfare, built wooden siege towers tall enough to fire down into the city's defenses, dug tunnels beneath the walls, and packed those tunnels with gunpowder charges that were detonated to breach the fortifications at several points simultaneously. The final assault, launched in October of 1552 after weeks of bombardment and mining, culminated in the city's capture after brutal, house-to-house fighting that reportedly left much of Kazan in ruins and cost heavy casualties on both sides. The fall of Kazan was celebrated across Russia as a triumph of enormous symbolic and strategic weight. For the first time, Moscow had conquered rather than merely resisted one of the Tatar Khanates that had dominated Russian lands since the era of the Mongol invasions 3 centuries earlier. To commemorate the victory, Ivan commissioned the construction of what would become St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square, its riot of colorful onion domes rising above the square as a deliberate monument to conquest, unlike anything Moscow's builders had raised before it. For years later, in 1556, Ivan's forces captured Astrakhan, another Tatar Khanate at the mouth of the Volga River, extending Russian control all the way to the Caspian Sea and opening trade routes that would enrich the realm for generations, linking Moscow's merchants directly to Persian and Central Asian markets along the Volga corridor in a way that had been effectively impossible while hostile Khanates controlled the river's middle and lower reaches. Between the two conquests, Ivan had, within the space of half a decade, more than doubled the effective territory under Moscow's control and permanently broken the 2-century pattern of Tatar Khanates threatening the Russian heartland from the south and east. These were not small achievements, and they should not be minimized simply because of what Ivan would later become. Military historians continue to study the Kazan campaign as a sophisticated combined arms operation for its era. Legal historians credit the Sudebnik of 1550 as an important step in the development of Russian law, noting in particular its provisions requiring more systematic record-keeping in local courts and its attempt, however imperfectly enforced in practice, to curb the arbitrary abuses of provincial governors known as namestniki, who had long extracted excessive fees and favors from the populations under their administration. and the territorial gains of these years reshaped the map of Eurasia in ways that outlasted Ivan by centuries, opening Siberia itself to eventual Russian expansion in the decades that followed his reign. Beginning with the Stroganov merchant family's sponsorship of the Cossack leader Yermak Timofeyevich, whose campaigns east of the Ural Mountains in the early 1580s, undertaken in the final years of Ivan's own life, laid the groundwork for a Russian presence across Siberia that would eventually stretch over the following century all the way to the Pacific coast. The Zemsky Sobor of 1549 that preceded these reforms drew together, in a single assembled body, representatives of the church hierarchy, the boyar aristocracy, the lower service nobility known as the dvoryanstvo, and delegates from the merchant classes of the major towns, a genuinely broad cross-section of the realm's free population, even if it excluded the peasantry, who remained almost entirely outside any formal political voice. Some historians have described this assembly, along with its successors convened later in Ivan's reign and by his successors, as evidence that Muscovite autocracy, however absolute in theory, still depended in practice on at least the appearance of broader consultation and consent, particularly in matters of taxation and war that placed heavy burdens on the population at large. Ivan, in these years, appears by the surviving evidence to have been genuinely popular, genuinely capable, and genuinely married to a woman who tempered his harsher impulses. Foreign ambassadors who met him during this period described a Tsar who was intelligent, well-read in scripture and history, and capable of long, engaged conversations about theology and governance. It is difficult, reading these accounts, to see the man who would later order the destruction of an entire city's population, or who would end his own son's life with a single blow. And yet the same volatile temperament that had been shaped by his childhood terror had not vanished. It had simply been, for a decade, well managed, by good advisors, by a stable marriage, and by the discipline of a young man determined to prove himself worthy of the title he had claimed at 16. That management would not survive the decade that followed. In 1560, Anastasia died. Anastasia Romanovna fell ill in the summer of 1560 after a period of prolonged travel and what contemporary accounts describe as a difficult pregnancy earlier that year. Her decline was, by the standards of the time, unusually prolonged and painful, and Ivan himself grew convinced, even as she lay dying, that she had been poisoned by his enemies at court. Specifically, he came to suspect members of the same boyar families whose earlier misrule had scarred his childhood. For centuries, historians treated this suspicion as the product of a grieving and already paranoid mind, a conviction born of grief rather than evidence. That assessment shifted in the 20th century when Soviet researchers exhumed and examined Anastasia's remains alongside those of other Kremlin-era royals. The analysis found significant concentrations of mercury and arsenic in her remains, levels that some toxicologists argue are difficult to explain through the medicinal use of such substances alone, given how they typically accumulate in hair and bone. Other researchers remain more cautious, noting that both mercury and arsenic compounds were common ingredients in 16th century remedies and cosmetics, and that establishing deliberate poisoning centuries after the fact, without a contemporary investigation or confession, is inherently difficult. What can be said with more confidence is that Ivan believed, absolutely and immediately, that his wife had been murdered, and that belief would reshape the remainder of his reign. The change in Ivan following Anastasia's death was noted by nearly every observer, Russian and foreign alike, who left a record of this period. The steadying influence she had provided for 13 years was gone, and with it went much of the young Tsar's patience for the advisors who had guided his early reforms. Sylvester and Alexei Adashev, the two men most associated with the chosen council and the reforms of the 1550s, fell from favor within a year of Anastasia's death. Sylvester was exiled to a monastery in the far north. Adashev was removed from court and sent to serve in the ongoing Livonian War before being placed under arrest, where he died, under circumstances that remain unclear, not long afterward, amid rumors, never proven, that Ivan had ordered his death as well. Adashev's own brother and several other relatives were executed outright in the purges that followed, a pattern that would recur throughout Ivan's reign. Disfavor rarely fell on an individual alone, but spread, through guilt by association, to entire extended families, a practice that magnified the terror of the Oprichnina years far beyond any single targeted execution. Ivan remarried within a year, to Maria Temryukovna, a princess from the Caucasus region whose foreign origins and, by several contemporary accounts, sharp and encouraging temperament toward Ivan's harsher instincts made her deeply unpopular among the boyar establishment. Whether Maria actively encouraged Ivan's growing paranoia and cruelty, as some hostile chroniclers of the period claimed, or whether she has simply been cast as a convenient villain by writers looking for someone other than Ivan himself to blame, is difficult to establish with confidence from the surviving sources. What is clear is that the marriage did nothing to restore the equilibrium Anastasia's presence had once provided. Psychologically, the pattern that emerges from this period is one many who have studied trauma across very different historical and cultural contexts would recognize. A man who had spent his childhood powerless amid violence and betrayal, who found in his marriage to Anastasia the first genuinely stable relationship of his life, and who, upon losing that stability to a death he could not control or fully explain, reverted to the defensive posture his earliest years had taught him: treat every relationship as provisional, assume betrayal before it manifests, and strike first against anyone who might, however remotely, pose a threat. None of this excuses what followed, but it offers at least a partial account of why a capable, popular young reformer became, within only a few years, one of history's most feared autocrats. The most consequential rupture of this period came in 1564, when Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a nobleman, military commander, and, by his own account, a former close friend and advisor of Ivan's, defected to Lithuania, then at war with Moscow, fearing that he would be next among the Tsar's advisors to fall victim to arrest or execution. From his exile, Kurbsky wrote a series of letters to Ivan that remain, to this day, among the most extraordinary documents of the era, a direct, scathing accusation from a former intimate, charging the Tsar with tyranny, ingratitude, and the murder of loyal servants. Ivan wrote back at length, and letters of his own that combined genuine theological erudition with searing personal invective, defending the absolute and God-given nature of his authority and accusing Kurbsky of betraying not merely his Tsar but the divine order itself. This exchange of letters matters for more than its historical color. It reveals, in Ivan's own words, the worldview that would justify everything that followed, a conviction that the Tsar's authority was granted directly by God, answerable to no earthly institution, and that any resistance to that authority, whether from a boyar family, a former friend, or eventually his own household, was not merely political opposition but a form of sin. Kurbsky's defection also confirmed, in Ivan's mind, exactly the fear that had haunted him since childhood, that the nobility around him could not be trusted, That betrayal could come from even the closest confidant, and that survival required a mechanism of control more absolute than anything the traditional structures of Moscow's aristocracy could provide. Kurbsky himself is worth understanding a little further, since he remains one of the central and most contested sources for nearly everything modern readers know about Ivan's darker conduct. A prince descended from the same Marikid line as Ivan's own family, Kurbsky had served with distinction in the Kazan campaign and stood among Ivan's most trusted military commanders before his defection. From his refuge in Lithuania, he went on to write not only his letters to Ivan but a fuller historical account, later titled by scholars The History of the Grand Prince of Moscow, which remains one of the primary narrative sources for Ivan's reign, including many of the anecdotes about his cruel childhood habits mentioned earlier in this account. Because Kurbsky wrote as a defector actively engaged in a war against his former sovereign, seeking to justify his own betrayal to Lithuanian and Polish patrons who were, at that very moment, fighting Ivan's armies, historians have always had to read his account with a careful eye toward its evident motive to blacken Ivan's reputation as thoroughly as possible. And yet enough of what Kurbsky describes is corroborated by other, more neutral sources, foreign merchants, diplomatic envoys with no stake in the Russian-Lithuanian conflict, and even some of Ivan's own surviving decrees, that most historians treat his account as exaggerated in places but fundamentally reliable in its broad outline. That mechanism arrived the following year, in the winter of 1565, in a moment of political theater unlike anything Moscow had witnessed before. In December of 1565, Ivan left Moscow abruptly, taking with him a portion of the treasury, sacred icons, and members of his household, and retreated to Aleksandrov Sloboda, the same fortified retreat where, 16 years later, the fatal encounter with his son would take place. From there, he sent 2 letters back to the capital. The first, addressed to the clergy and boyars, accused them of treason and announced his intention to abdicate the throne entirely. The second, addressed to the merchants and common people of Moscow, assured them that his anger was directed only at the treacherous nobility, not at them. The effect was immediate and, in a sense, exactly what Ivan appears to have calculated. Moscow without a Tsar was, in the political imagination of the 16th century, an almost unthinkable prospect, a vacuum that threatened chaos, foreign invasion, and the collapse of the social order. Delegations of clergy and boyars traveled to Aleksandrov Sloboda to beg Ivan to return. He agreed, but only on his own terms. He would resume the throne, but only if granted the authority to establish a new and separate domain, the Oprichnina, over which he would rule directly and without the constraints of traditional boyar council, alongside the Zemshchina, the remainder of the realm that would continue to be administered through the older institutions. The Oprichnina was, in practice, both a territory and an instrument of terror. Ivan carved out for himself a swath of land including some of the wealthiest and most strategically significant regions of the realm, key trade towns, salt-producing districts, and estates along the most important northern routes, and staffed its administration with a new class of loyalists, the Oprichniki, who answered to him alone and swore a personal oath of loyalty that placed their obedience to the Tsar above any obligation to family, community, or the ordinary boyar hierarchy they had come from. These men rode dressed in black, their saddles reportedly adorned with the symbols of a dog's head and a broom, meant to represent their duty to sniff out treason and sweep it from the realm. They operated with what amounted to legal immunity, empowered to confiscate property, expel or execute boyars accused of disloyalty, and enforce Ivan's will without the oversight of any traditional court. Landowning families within the newly designated Oprichnina territory who were not themselves inducted into the new order were frequently expelled outright, their estates redistributed to Oprichniki loyalists, in a process that amounted to one of the largest forced transfers of land and status in Russian history to that point, uprooting thousands of families from ancestral holdings some had occupied for generations. Estimates of the death toll directly attributable to the Oprichnina's operations vary considerably among historians, and precise figures are difficult to establish given the incomplete and sometimes politically motivated nature of surviving records. What is not in serious dispute is the campaign's most infamous single episode, the sack of Novgorod in the winter of 1569 into 1570. Ivan, acting on accusations, almost certainly false, based on a forged letter, that Novgorod's leadership intended to defect to Poland-Lithuania, marched on the city with his Oprichniki and subjected it to weeks of massacre, torture, and pillage. Chronicled death tolls from contemporary and near-contemporary sources range from several thousand to numbers that would represent a substantial portion of the city's entire population. And while modern historians generally regard the highest contemporary estimates as exaggerated, there is broad agreement that the destruction was severe enough to permanently damage what had been one of Russia's wealthiest trading cities, a rival in commercial importance to Moscow itself. The Novgorod campaign itself unfolded over roughly 5 weeks in the depths of a northern Russian winter, with Ivan's forces first sealing off the city to prevent any escape across the frozen approaches, then conducting daily rounds of arrests, interrogation, and execution that foreign accounts compiled decades later describe in harrowing detail this account will not repeat in full, since the purpose here is to convey the scale and character of the violence rather than to dwell on its mechanics. What matters for understanding Ivan's reign is the pattern the massacre represents. An entire city's population held collectively responsible for the suspected disloyalty of a small number of its leading citizens, punished on the authority of a single forged document, by a ruler whose experience of childhood had taught him that suspicion, once raised, was safer to act upon violently than to leave unresolved. Archbishop Pimen of Novgorod, the city's own senior churchman, was among those arrested and later died in confinement, while the city's trade and administrative institutions took generations to recover their former prominence, if they ever fully did. The man most closely associated with the Oprichnina's machinery of terror, Malyuta Skuratov, rose from relatively modest noble origins to become one of the most feared figures in Ivan's court, entrusted with interrogations, executions, and, as later accounts suggest, the killing of Metropolitan Philip. Skuratov's own daughter would eventually marry into the Godunov family, linking the Oprichnina's chief enforcer, however distantly, to the very dynasty that would take the Russian throne after Ivan's line collapsed. One of several strange threads connecting the era's worst violence to the political order that emerged from its aftermath. Skuratov himself died in 1573 during a campaign against Swedish forces in Livonia, and Ivan, by several accounts, mourned him with a sincerity that startled observers accustomed to thinking of the Tsar's enforcers as disposable instruments rather than men whose loss might genuinely grieve him. Ivan reportedly ordered an unusually lavish funeral and burial for Skuratov, breaking with the more modest arrangements typically afforded even senior Oprichniki, a gesture some courtiers privately read as evidence of just how few men Ivan felt he could trust without reservation by this point in his reign, and how deeply the loss of one of them, however feared and disliked by the wider nobility, genuinely unsettled him. It would be a distortion to treat this period purely as senseless cruelty without any strategic logic behind it, and it would be an equal distortion to excuse its brutality by pointing to that logic. Some historians argue the Oprichnina served a genuine centralizing function, breaking the independent power of regional boyar clans and consolidating authority directly under the Tsar in a way that outlasted Ivan's reign and shaped the more centralized Russian state that followed. Others argue that whatever centralizing effect it achieved came at a catastrophic and unnecessary human cost, driven at least as much by Ivan's personal paranoia and grief over Anastasia as by any coherent program of state building. Both readings likely capture part of the truth. The Oprichnina was simultaneously a tool of state centralization and an instrument of one increasingly unstable man's fear, and the two purposes fed each other. Every act of terror against a boyar family confirmed, in Ivan's mind, that the nobility could not be trusted, which justified further terror, in a cycle that would not fully abate until Ivan formally dissolved the Oprichnina as a separate institution in 1572, folding many of its functions back into the ordinary administration of the realm, though its atmosphere of suspicion and informant-driven denunciation persisted for the remainder of his reign. By the early 1570s, the court over which Ivan presided bore little resemblance to the hopeful, reform-minded assembly of his early reign. Advisors who fell from favor could expect not merely dismissal but torture and execution, often carried out with elaborate and deliberately public cruelty intended to reinforce the Tsar's absolute power over life and death. The chronicles of foreign visitors to Moscow in this period, English merchants such as Jerome Horsey and Giles Fletcher, papal envoys, and captured soldiers who later wrote memoirs, describe a capital where informants were rewarded for denouncing their neighbors, where the wealthy lived in constant anxiety over whether their next summons to the palace would be an honor or a death sentence, and where the Tsar himself alternated between violent rage and periods of intense, almost theatrical, religious penance. Fletcher, who visited Russia as an English diplomat later in Ivan's reign, described a realm where fear had become so pervasive among the nobility that even the wealthiest families avoided any outward display of prosperity, fearing it would draw the attention of informants eager to report supposed disloyalty in exchange for a share of the confiscated estate that would follow. This latter pattern deserves attention because it complicates any simple portrait of Ivan as a man without conscience. He established, at Aleksandrov Sloboda, something resembling a monastic brotherhood among his closest oprychniki, complete with black robes, communal prayers at odd hours of the night, and elaborate rituals of confession and self-mortification, even as the same men spent their days carrying out arrests, tortures, and executions on his order. Ivan personally donated enormous sums to monasteries for prayers on behalf of those he had ordered killed, and compiled, late in his reign, a formal list, the Synodic of the Disgraced, naming many of his victims so that monks could pray for their souls. Whether this reflects genuine, tortured remorse, or a more calculated effort to secure his own salvation while continuing the behavior that necessitated it, is a question historians and theologians have debated for centuries without arriving at any consensus, and it may be that both motives coexisted within the same man, at the same time, without resolution. The physical instruments and settings of this terror varied: public squares in Moscow where executions were staged before crowds as a deliberate demonstration of the Tsar's power, remote monasteries where fallen advisors were exiled to live out their remaining years in enforced isolation, and the private chambers of Aleksandrov Sloboda itself, where Ivan's own black-robed brotherhood conducted interrogations shielded from any outside witness. This account will not dwell on the specific mechanics of these punishments. What matters for understanding the man and the court he built is the pervasive psychological effect such methods had on everyone around him, cultivating a climate in which loyalty was no longer sufficient protection and in which even the Tsar's closest companions understood that his favor could turn, without warning, into a sentence of death. One episode from this period illustrates the atmosphere of the court with particular clarity: the death of Metropolitan Philip II, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, in 1569. Philip had publicly criticized the Oprichnina's brutality, reportedly refusing, on one occasion, to grant Ivan a blessing during a church service until the Tsar addressed the killings, and was subsequently deposed, imprisoned, and, according to the most widely accepted account, murdered later that year by Malyuta Skuratov, one of Ivan's most notorious Oprichniki enforcers, while Ivan's army was en route to Novgorod. Some later accounts suggest Ivan personally ordered the killing to prevent Philip from blessing the city he was about to destroy. Others suggest Skuratov acted on his own initiative, perhaps to curry favor, and that Ivan's precise degree of direct culpability remains genuinely uncertain. The Church would eventually canonize Philip as a saint, and his death remains one of the most cited examples of the collision between religious authority and Ivan's absolute power during these years. Ivan's marriages during this period reflect the same instability. After Maria Temryukovna's death in 1569, by some accounts from illness, though poison was suspected here as in so many other deaths at Ivan's court, he married in rapid succession several more times, a practice that placed him in open tension with Orthodox canon law, which permitted at most 3 marriages for any layman. Ivan's 4th marriage, to Anna Koltovskaya, required special ecclesiastical dispensation, granted only on the condition of a period of public penance, and even then, church authorities never fully sanctioned the marriages that followed it, some of which appear to have been conducted with minimal or contested clerical approval. By the end of his life, Ivan had married somewhere between 6 and 8 times, depending on which unions later church and state authorities chose to recognize as legitimate, an extraordinary and, for an Orthodox monarch, deeply irregular pattern that reflects both his personal instability and the difficulty anyone around him faced in refusing whatever the Tsar demanded. Several of these later wives disappeared from the historical record almost as quickly as they entered it, dispatched to convents within months of marriage for reasons that were rarely explained and rarely questioned by anyone with the power to object. 1. Marfa Sobakina died within weeks of her wedding in 1571 under circumstances contemporaries again attributed to poison, though as with so many sudden deaths in Ivan's circle, no investigation of the period established a cause with any certainty modern historians would find satisfying. It was into this atmosphere, a court defined by terror, informants, elaborate religious guilt, and a ruler whose mood shifted without warning between devotion and violence, that Ivan's eldest surviving son grew from childhood into manhood, groomed from his earliest years to be the next Tsar of Russia. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich was born in March of 1554, the second son of Ivan and Anastasia, and the eldest to survive infancy after his older brother Dmitry died as an infant in a tragic accident during a pilgrimage journey when a nursemaid slipped while carrying him across a boat's gangplank. From the moment of his birth, the younger Ivan's life was oriented entirely around a single purpose: preparation to inherit the throne his father had claimed as Tsar. He grew up largely at his father's side rather than sequestered in a separate household, an arrangement that meant the younger Ivan witnessed, from a young age, both the constructive and the catastrophic sides of his father's rule. He was present, by most surviving accounts, for at least some of the Oprichnina's operations, and some chroniclers, again, largely hostile ones. So their claims warrant the same caution applied to similar accusations elsewhere in this story, alleged that the Tsarevich personally participated in punishments during the sack of Novgorod, riding alongside the Oprichniki his father commanded. Other historians argue the evidence for his direct participation in specific atrocities is thinner than these accounts suggest, and that his presence at his father's court during this period reflects his role as heir in training rather than proof of personal cruelty on his own part. What is better documented is the Tsarevich's intellectual and religious formation. He appears to have shared his father's genuine interest in Orthodox theology and Russian religious history, and is credited by some scholars with contributing to, or at minimum closely supervising, an expanded edition of the life of Saint Anthony of Sia, a hagiographic text, suggesting a young man raised not merely in the arts of war and statecraft, but in the literary and devotional culture that his father, whatever his crimes, also genuinely valued. Foreign observers who encountered the younger Ivan at court described him as intelligent, and some suggested he showed early signs of a temperament less volatile than his father's, tempered perhaps by watching, from close range, exactly where unchecked rage could lead. The Tsarevich also took an active role in the military campaigns that consumed much of Ivan the Elder's later reign, particularly the long and ultimately unsuccessful Livonian War, a decades-long conflict. Beginning in 1558, fought against Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and other regional powers over control of territory along the Baltic coast, a war whose early, promising gains against the crumbling Livonian order gradually reversed as Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden consolidated their own claims to the contested territory, and as the Oprichnina's internal turmoil drained resources and experienced commanders away from the front. The Tsarevich's education, in its earlier years, followed a pattern common to Muscovite royal upbringing, instruction in scripture and church liturgy from an early age, supplemented by tutors versed in the chronicled histories of Russia and Byzantium that Ivan himself prized so highly, and, as he grew older, direct exposure to the practical business of governance through attendance at his father's councils and audiences with foreign envoys. Several surviving diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors who had occasion to meet the Tsarevich describe him as sharp in conversation and unusually well informed for a young man who had not yet ruled in his own right, suggesting that whatever damage the environment of Ivan's court had done to the younger man's temperament, it had not dulled his intellect or his grasp of the political world he was being prepared to inherit. By the early 1580s, this war had drained the treasury, cost enormous numbers of lives, and was moving toward a settlement that would strip Russia of most of the territorial gains it had made earlier in the conflict. A humiliating reversal for a Tsar who had built so much of his early reputation on the conquests of Kazan and Astrakhan. Some accounts suggest that the Tsarevich, frustrated by the war's failing fortunes, at one point requested his father's permission to personally lead a relief force to the besieged fortress of Pskov, and that Ivan refused, either from strategic caution or from a reluctance to risk his heir, or, according to some later and less reliable accounts, from a flash of suspicion that his son sought too much independent authority and popularity with the army. Whichever motive is closest to the truth, the refusal is sometimes cited as an early sign of friction between father and son that had begun to surface even before the events of November 1581. Friction that would combine with a much more personal and immediate conflict to produce the tragedy that followed. By the late 1570s, the war's fortunes had turned sharply against Moscow. The Polish King Stefan Batory, an experienced military commander elected to the Polish-Lithuanian throne in 1576, proved a far more formidable adversary than his predecessors, recapturing key fortresses and, by 1581, laying siege to Pskov itself, one of the last major Russian strongholds still standing between the advancing Polish-Lithuanian army and the Russian heartland. The stubborn defense of Pskov that year, led by the voivode Ivan Shuaysky, would ultimately hold, but the broader trajectory of the war was, by the time of the argument in Aleksandrov Sloboda, unmistakably one of Russian retreat and mounting national humiliation after decades of costly fighting. By 1581, the younger Ivan was 27 years old, married for the third time, and, in the eyes of the court and the wider world, the obvious and unquestioned heir to his father's throne. Whatever tensions existed between the two men over the war or over questions of authority, nothing in the surviving record suggests anyone anticipated that the relationship between father and son would end not through slow political rivalry, but through a single argument over the clothing of the Tsarevich's wife. Marriage among the Muscovite elite of this period was rarely a matter left to personal preference in any case, but the Tsarevich's situation was unusual even by the standards of a court where most unions served dynastic or political purposes rather than personal affection. Because his father retained such total authority over every aspect of court life, the Tsarevich's marriages functioned less as ordinary aristocratic matches and more as extensions of the elder Ivan's own shifting alliances and suspicions, subject to reversal at the Tsar's whim regardless of how the marriage itself was actually functioning. The younger Ivan's marital history mirrors, in miniature, the volatility of his father's court. His first wife, Evdokia Sabirova, whom he married around 1571, was forced into a convent by the elder Ivan in 1575. The surviving reasons for this decision are unclear, though it fits a broader pattern in which Ivan the Elder exercised direct and often arbitrary control over the marriages of those closest to him, including, on several occasions, forcing daughters-in-law into monastic life for reasons that ranged from failure to produce an heir quickly enough to simple accusations of misconduct that modern historians generally treat with considerable skepticism, given how frequently such accusations conveniently served the elder Tsar's own preferences. The Tsarevich's second wife, Praskovia Solovaya, suffered an identical fate, married around 1575 or 1576, sent to a convent by the elder Ivan's order in 1579, again for reasons that the surviving sources describe only vaguely, generally citing infertility, though some historians suspect the elder Ivan's interventions in his son's marriages reflected less a genuine concern for producing heirs and more a broader pattern of exercising total control over every aspect of his son's life, refusing to allow the Tsarevich even the basic autonomy of choosing and keeping a wife of his own preference. In 1581, the Tsarevich married a third time, to Elena Sheremeteva, daughter of a prominent boyar family whose own relations had not entirely escaped the elder Ivan's suspicion in earlier years. By the time of the events that November, Elena was pregnant, a fact that would make what followed considerably more consequential than a simple domestic dispute, since a successful pregnancy would have secured the succession for at least another generation, at a moment when the elder Ivan's own health was failing and the dynasty's future rested almost entirely on his son producing an heir of his own. The practice of sending royal daughters-in-law to convents for failing to produce children quickly enough reflected a broader anxiety that ran through the entire Muscovite ruling house in this period. With infant and child mortality high even among the wealthiest families, and with the Rurik line's own continuation resting on a small handful of surviving sons, the pressure on each of Ivan's daughters-in-law to conceive and carry a child successfully was immense, and the consequences of failing to do so, as two of the Tsarevich's own wives had already discovered, could be swift and final. The immediate context for the argument that would end the Tsarevich's life involves a detail that can seem, on its surface, almost trivial: the traditional expectation in the royal household that women of the court dress in multiple layers of clothing as a mark of modesty and status. According to the most widely repeated account, drawn primarily from the writings of the papal envoy Antonio Passavino, who was present in Russia during this period on a diplomatic mission and recorded second-hand reports circulating at court shortly after the events in question, Ivan the Elder came upon his pregnant daughter-in-law dressed in only a single layer of clothing rather than the traditional three, and, in a fury, struck her, whether because he judged this a genuine breach of propriety, or because his temper by this point in his life required only the slightest pretext to erupt into violence, is impossible to establish with certainty from sources written after the fact by people who were not in the room. Some accounts suggest the blow, or the shock of the confrontation, caused Elena to miscarry, though the timing and even the certainty of this pregnancy loss vary between sources, and modern historians treat this detail as plausible but not conclusively established. What is better attested is that the Tsarevich, hearing his wife's distress, entered the room where his father was confronting her and objected, the first and, as it would tragically prove, the last time the son directly and publicly challenged his father's treatment of someone under his protection. You are asked, now, to imagine not a battlefield or a throne room, but an ordinary domestic space within the wooden palace complex at Aleksandrov Sloboda, a private chamber, likely close to the women's quarters, where the argument that would end a dynasty's direct male line began not as a matter of state but as a family dispute over propriety and dress. The elder Ivan, by November of 1581, was 51 years old, though decades of stress, guilt, and by some accounts a range of physical ailments. Later forensic analysis of his remains would find evidence consistent with severe skeletal deterioration, and some researchers have speculated, without full certainty, that mercury exposure from medicinal treatments he received throughout his life may have contributed to both his physical decline and a possible worsening of his temperament in his final years, had left him looking and moving like a considerably older man. He was, by this point in his reign, a figure both feared and physically diminished, prone to violent outbursts that those around him had learned, through hard experience, to avoid provoking. When Ivan encountered his daughter-in-law dressed, in his judgment, inappropriately, the confrontation that followed drew directly on decades of accumulated volatility. Some historians describe his reaction less as a considered judgment about propriety and more as an eruption that, given his documented history, could have been triggered by almost any perceived slight on almost any day. Elena's distress, and the physical altercation that some sources describe, brought her husband into the room. What the Tsarevich said to his father in that moment is not recorded in any source contemporary enough to be trusted with precision. Later accounts, written well after the fact and shaped by the retellings of a court eager to make sense of tragedy, describe the son remonstrating with his father, defending his wife, perhaps invoking his own authority as her husband and as heir to the throne, perhaps simply expressing, for the first time in his adult life, open anger at treatment he had spent nearly 3 decades learning to accept without protest. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of this moment within the larger pattern of the Tsarevich's life. For 27 years, he had watched his father humiliate, exile, and destroy men of far greater standing than himself without ever, so far as any surviving record indicates, raising open objection. He had watched 2 of his own wives sent to convents on his father's orders and, apparently, accepted those losses without recorded protest. Whatever finally moved him to speak against his father in defense of Elena, whether it was the specific cruelty of striking a pregnant woman, the accumulated weight of years of silent compliance finally breaking, or the added provocation of the war in Pskov, this was, by every indication in the sources, the first time in his adult life that Tsarevich chose confrontation over deference. That this single break from a lifetime of caution would also be his last act deepens rather than simplifies the tragedy. Some later accounts add a further layer of political tension to the confrontation, suggesting that the argument expanded beyond the immediate matter of Elena's clothing into the broader, already simmering dispute over the war effort that the Tsarevich, emboldened by his anger, raised again his earlier request to lead troops to relieve the siege at Pskov, and accused his father, in the heat of the moment, of cowardice or mismanagement in prosecuting a war that was now visibly failing. Whether this political dimension genuinely featured in the argument, or whether it was added by later chroniclers seeking to give the tragedy a grander, more historically legible cause than a dispute over a daughter-in-law's dress, remains a point of real disagreement among historians. It is entirely possible that both elements were present, that a father's rage over perceived domestic impropriety fused, in a matter of moments, with years of accumulated political friction between an aging, failing autocrat and the adult son he had never fully allowed to exercise independent authority. What is not disputed is the outcome. In front of witnesses close enough to the chamber to hear raised voices, though not, apparently, close enough or brave enough to intervene, the Tsar's rage passed a threshold it had never before crossed with this particular son. The staff from the Prologue, iron-tipped, carried everywhere, a symbol of pilgrimage and penance that Ivan had carried for years as part of his elaborate performance of religious humility even as he ordered the deaths of hundreds, was in his hand. You do not need to see the moment itself to understand it. Picture, instead, the door. A heavy wooden door, its iron fittings dark with age, closed against a corridor where servants and courtiers stood frozen, listening to voices rise beyond what any of them had heard from this particular relationship before. Picture the sound that silenced those voices, not a cry, not immediately, but something duller and more final, an impact, and then a stillness so complete that those in the corridor would later struggle to describe it, because stillness of that particular kind rarely follows a father's argument with his son. Picture the room afterward, described secondhand by those permitted, moments later, to enter it. The Tsarevich on the floor. A wound at his temple, where the iron-shod tip of his father's staff had struck him. And the father himself, a man capable, by every account of the preceding decades, of ordering torture and massacre without visible hesitation, now on his knees beside his son, according to the accounts that survive, cradling his head, calling for physicians, weeping in a way that witnesses described as almost unrecognizable from the composed, imperious Tsar they had known. Whether the blow was intended to kill, or even intended to strike the head at all, is a question the surviving evidence cannot answer with certainty. Some accounts suggest Ivan aimed the blow at his son's body during the general fury of the confrontation and struck the temple by accident, in the chaotic motion of an old man's rage rather than through any calculated intent. Others, less charitably, suggest that whatever the precise trajectory of the blow, It came from a man whose decades of unrestrained violence had made him simply incapable, in a moment of extreme anger, of the restraint that any father should exercise toward an unarmed son standing before him. The historical record, drawn largely from the retrospective accounts of chroniclers and the second-hand diplomatic report of Antonio Passavino, does not allow a confident reconstruction of intent. What it does allow is a clear account of consequence. The Tsarevich did not die instantly. He lingered, conscious at times, for several days, attended by physicians his father summoned in what witnesses described as a state of desperate, uncharacteristic panic. The same man who had shown so little apparent concern for the suffering of countless other victims now begging, by some accounts, for his son's life to be spared, offering prayers, vigils, and reportedly even his own throne in exchange for his son's recovery, though whether that particular detail reflects an authentic offer or a later embellishment meant to heighten the tragedy is impossible to confirm. Physicians of the period, summoned in a panic that contrasted so sharply with the Tsar's usual composure, would have had little genuine ability to treat a traumatic head injury of this severity. 16th century medicine, in Russia as elsewhere in Europe, possessed no real understanding of intracranial bleeding or swelling, and the herbal remedies, prayers, and folk treatments applied to the Tsarevich in his final days almost certainly did nothing to slow the injury's progress, whatever comfort they may have offered the dying man and his desperate father. On the 19th of November, 1581, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich died of his wound. The staff, according to no source in particular but consistent with the quiet logic of the story that has come down through the centuries, is said to have fallen from Ivan's hand in the moment of the blow and remained on the floor of that chamber until servants, some time later, gathered the courage to enter and remove it. Whatever became of the object itself, it survives now only as a symbol, the instrument through which one of history's most consequential single acts of violence passed from an old man's grief and rage into the permanent record of a dynasty's collapse. The days between the blow and the Tsarevich's death, and the weeks that followed it, reveal a side of Ivan the Terrible that sits uneasily alongside the man responsible for Novgorod and the Oprichnina's years of terror. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe a ruler consumed by visible, almost theatrical grief, a father who insisted on maintaining a vigil at his son's bedside, who wept openly before courtiers in a break from the composed and menacing public persona he had cultivated for decades, and who, according to several sources, aged visibly and rapidly in the aftermath, his health declining sharply over the 2.5 years of life that remained to him. Ivan reportedly commissioned extensive prayers and donations to monasteries for his son's soul, adding the Tsarevich's name to lists of the departed for whom perpetual prayers were to be offered, the same practice he had used, in earlier years, to seek absolution for the victims of his own purges. Whether this grief reflected pure paternal love, an added layer of guilt specific to having caused the death himself, or some genuine reckoning with the pattern of violence that had now consumed even his own family, is a question no surviving source can settle definitively, though the intensity and duration of his mourning, as described across multiple independent accounts, argues against dismissing it as pure political theater. Beyond the personal grief, the death carried immediate and enormous political weight. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich had been, for 27 years, the unquestioned heir to the throne, competent, engaged in matters of state and war, and by most assessments considerably better suited to eventual rule than his younger brother. With his death, the line of succession fell to Feofor Ivanovich, the elder Ivan's third son, a young man whose temperament and evident limitations were, by this point, well known throughout the court and, increasingly, to foreign observers as well. In the immediate days following the Tsarevich's death, the household at Aleksandrov Sloboda observed the traditional Orthodox rites of mourning, the body washed, dressed, and laid out for viewing, priests chanting continuous psalms over the coffin through the night, and a funeral procession that carried the Tsarevich's remains back to Moscow for burial in the Kremlin's Archangel Cathedral, the traditional resting place of the ruling house, where generations of Ivan's ancestors already lay and where his son's grave would remain undisturbed for nearly 4 centuries until the forensic examinations of the 20th century opened it once more. The panic this produced among the boyar elite and the wider political establishment should not be understated. In a realm where the Tsar's authority rested so heavily on the aura of divinely sanctioned, absolute rule, the prospect of a weak or incapable successor threatened not merely a change in leadership style but the entire structure of stability the Oprichnina years and the earlier reforms had, however brutally, established. Foreign courts took immediate notice as well, ambassadors from Poland, Lithuania, England, and the Holy Roman Empire dispatched reports home assessing what the loss of the capable heir might mean for Russia already strained by the failing Livonian War and by decades of internal terror that had depleted both the treasury and the ranks of experienced administrators willing to serve without fear. Ivan himself, in the aftermath, seems to have understood exactly what he had done to the future of the realm he had spent his life building and terrorizing in equal measure. Surviving accounts describe him lamenting, in the presence of courtiers, that he had destroyed his own succession with his own hand, an admission remarkable both for its rarity, since Ivan rarely accepted blame for anything in his long and violent reign, and for its accuracy, since the consequences of that single blow would indeed unfold, over the following decades, into one of the most severe succession crises in Russian history. Ivan also, according to several accounts, sent substantial sums to monasteries across the realm and even to monastic communities on Mount Athos in Greece, requesting perpetual prayers for his son's soul, a gesture that placed the Tsarevich's name alongside the growing list of victims of the Oprichnina for whom Ivan had, in earlier years, sought similar intercession. An uncomfortable equivalence that the Tsar himself may or may not have consciously registered as he arranged for his son to be remembered in the same manner as the boyars and clergy he had ordered killed in the previous 2 decades. Feofor Ivanovich, born in 1557 to Ivan and Anastasia and thus the Tsarevich's younger full brother, had spent his life very much in the shadow of his more capable elder brother, and by the accounts of virtually every observer who left a record of him, he was simply not built for the demands of autocratic rule. Where the elder Ivan Ivanovich had been raised at his father's side, present at councils and campaigns, groomed deliberately for the throne he was expected to inherit, Feofor's upbringing appears to have followed a gentler, more sheltered course, oriented from an early age toward religious devotion rather than statecraft, perhaps because his more evident temperament made such preparation the more natural path, or perhaps simply because a spare heir, and a court already anxiously focused on its firstborn son, received less deliberate cultivation for rule than the boy expected to actually wear the crown. Foreign ambassadors described him as gentle, deeply pious to the point of spending long hours each day in prayer and religious observance. He was known affectionately among some later chroniclers as the bell ringer for his habit of ringing church bells himself, and largely uninterested in or incapable of the political maneuvering and occasional ruthlessness that rule over 16th century Russia seemed to require. Some historians have speculated that Feofor's limitations may have had a physical or developmental basis, though the sources are too thin and too colored by later political narratives to support a confident diagnosis across the centuries. What can be said with more confidence is that Ivan the Elder, in his final years, appears to have recognized his younger son's unsuitability for rule with painful clarity, and that this recognition compounded the grief and guilt he already carried over the death of his elder son. Some accounts attribute to Ivan a bitter private acknowledgement that Feofr would need constant guidance and support simply to hold the throne, let alone govern effectively, an acknowledgement that set in motion, even before Ivan's own death, the political arrangements that would define the following reign. Ivan had, by this time, one further son, Dmitri, born in 1582 to Maria Nagaya, Ivan's seventh or eighth wife, depending on which unions are counted as canonically valid. Because this marriage lacked full ecclesiastical sanction, falling well outside the limit of 3 marriages generally permitted under Orthodox canon law, Dmitri's legitimacy as a potential heir was itself contested from birth, and in any case he was only an infant at the time of Ivan's own death 2 years later, in no position to serve as a viable alternative to Feofr even had his legitimacy been beyond question. The contrast between the 2 surviving brothers could hardly have been sharper for a court that had spent decades absorbing the elder Ivan's example of rule through fear and personal domination. Feofr's court routine, as later described by foreign observers who encountered him during his own reign, revolved around long church services, ceremonial appearances that were largely symbolic, and an evident reliance on those around him for even routine administrative decisions, a temperament perhaps well suited to a quieter age, but one that left an enormous vacuum of practical authority precisely at the moment such authority was most needed to prevent the ambitious men of the court from maneuvering against one another for control. The stage was set, in other words, for a succession the realm was ill-equipped to manage, an infant of contested legitimacy, and a grown but incapable elder heir, in place of the seasoned, engaged Tsarevich whose death had removed the one succession path that might have carried Ivan's line forward with real continuity and competence. Whatever combination of domestic fury and long-simmering political frustration had produced the blow in November 1581, its consequence was to leave the Rurik dynasty, the ruling house that had governed Russian lands in one form or another for over 700 years, tracing its lineage back to the semi-legendary Norse Prince Rurik of the 9th century, depended on a single, ill-suited heir for its survival. The boyar elite, watching this unfold, understood the stakes with a clarity that the surviving court correspondence of the following years makes plain. Several leading families began, even before Ivan's own death, quietly positioning themselves and their allies for the influence they expected to wield once the throne passed to a ruler unable or unwilling to govern with his father's iron grip. Among these families, the Godunovs, connected to the court through Boris Godunov's marriage into Malyuta Skuratov's family and his sister Irina's marriage to Feofr himself, would prove the most successful, though the process by which Boris Godunov transformed himself from a capable courtier into the dominant power behind Feofr's throne, and eventually into Tsar in his own right, unfolded gradually across the better part of a decade rather than through any single dramatic seizure of authority. Ivan the Terrible died on the 18th of March, 1584, at the age of 53. According to a persistent and often repeated account, he collapsed while playing a game of chess, arranging the pieces on the board with Boris Godunov and another courtier moments before he fell, though the precision of this detail, appealing as it is, should be treated with the same caution applied to many colorful anecdotes from this period, since it appears primarily in later retellings rather than the most immediate contemporary records. Some accounts from foreign observers present in Moscow at the time add that Ivan had, in his final days, consulted astrologers and soothsayers he had summoned from as far as Lapland, seeking to know the date of his own death, a detail that, whether precisely accurate or not, fits well with the broader picture of a ruler who combined genuine Orthodox piety with a persistent, almost superstitious anxiety about hidden threats and hidden knowledge throughout his life. What is better documented is the physical state Ivan had fallen into by the final years of his life. Witnesses and later forensic examination alike describe a man who, though only in his early 50s, had the physical condition of someone decades older, his joints swollen and immobile, his skin discolored, his overall health so deteriorated that some modern researchers, examining his remains in the 20th century, proposed that chronic mercury exposure, potentially from decades of medicinal treatments applied to his various ailments, may have contributed significantly to both his physical decline and, some have speculated, the volatility of temperament that had marked so much of his final years, including the winter night in Aleksandrov Sloboda. This remains a hypothesis rather than an established fact, since correlating centuries-old toxicological traces with behavior is an inherently uncertain exercise, but it has become one of the more widely discussed explanations offered by researchers seeking to understand, without excusing, the pattern of Ivan's later conduct. Upon Ivan's death, Fifer Ivanovich ascended the throne as Fifer I, recognizing his own limitations, or perhaps simply reflecting the political reality that others recognized them clearly enough on his behalf. Fifer relied heavily throughout his reign on a council of regents, among whom Boris Godunov, a boyar of Tatar noble descent who had risen through service in Ivan's court and had married into Fifer's inner circle, gradually emerged as the dominant figure. By most assessments, actual governance during Fifer's 14-year reign was conducted primarily by Godunov, while Fifer himself occupied the throne largely as a devout and well-liked, if politically passive, figurehead. Fifer's reign was not without genuine accomplishment. Under Godunov's effective administration, Russia established the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1589. Elevating the Russian Orthodox Church to full patriarchal status independent of Constantinople's oversight for the first time, a change of considerable religious and political significance that placed the Russian Church, at least in ceremonial rank, alongside the other ancient patriarchates of the Orthodox world. Godunov's administration also pursued further consolidation of the frontier, extending fortified lines further south and east against Tatar raiding and continuing the Siberian expansion begun under Ivan, while pursuing a more cautious and generally successful foreign policy than the ruinous wars of Ivan's final decades. Yet the central problem that Ivan's blow in 1581 had created, the absence of a clear, capable, direct heir, remained unresolved throughout Fifer's reign because Fifer and his wife Irina, Godunov's sister, produced only one daughter, who died in infancy, leaving the couple without any surviving children. In 1591, the youngest of Ivan's sons, Dmitri, then residing with his mother in the town of Uglich, died under circumstances that have never been fully resolved. The official investigation, conducted under Godunov's direction, concluded that the boy, who was reported to suffer from epilepsy, had accidentally stabbed himself during a seizure while playing with a knife, a conclusion the investigating commission, headed by the boyar Vasily Shuaysky, formally confirmed after interviewing witnesses in Uglich itself. Many at the time, and many historians since, have suspected instead that Dmitri was murdered, quite possibly on Godunov's orders, to remove the last surviving obstacle to Godunov's own eventual claim on the throne, though, As with so much else in this story, the evidence does not permit a fully confident verdict, and some scholars continue to defend the accidental death explanation as plausible on its own medical merits, noting that self-inflicted injury during an epileptic seizure while holding a knife is a recognized, if rare, occurrence. The people of Uglich themselves did not accept the official verdict. A riot broke out in the town amid rumors of murder, and several officials suspected of complicity were killed by the crowd before order was restored, an early tremor of the much larger crisis of legitimacy that would follow within the decade. Fifer Ivanovich died in 1598 without an heir, bringing the Rurik dynasty's direct male line to a formal end after more than 7 centuries of nominal continuity. Boris Godunov, who had governed in all but name for over a decade, was elected Tsar by a specially convened Zemsky Sobor, the same consultative institution Ivan the Terrible had first summoned nearly 50 years earlier, becoming the first Russian ruler in centuries to hold the throne without a direct hereditary claim to the Rurik line. Boris Godunov's own rise deserves a moment's attention, since the man who would eventually rule as Tsar in his own right began his career simply as one of many minor courtiers seeking advancement within Ivan's Oprichnina apparatus. His sister's marriage to Fifer, arranged during Ivan's own lifetime, gave Godunov a foothold at the very center of the succeeding reign, and his evident administrative competence, combined with Fifer's own disinclination to manage state affairs personally, allowed him to accumulate effective control over foreign policy, taxation, and court appointments well before he took the throne outright. Foreign envoys who dealt with Godunov during Fifer's reign generally described him as capable, cautious, and unusually attentive to the practical business of governance compared to many of the boyar magnates around him, qualities that made him, in the eyes of the Zemsky Sobor that elected him in 1598, a plausible steward of the realm, whatever reservations some may have privately held about a Tsar who could claim no direct hereditary right to the throne he now occupied. Godunov's reign began under difficult circumstances and only deteriorated further. A catastrophic famine between 1601 and 1603, caused by a series of failed harvests linked to unusually cold summers now understood to have resulted from a distant volcanic eruption disrupting global climate patterns, killed a substantial portion of the Russian population and shattered whatever fragile legitimacy Godunov's rule had established. Amid the chaos, rumors began to circulate that Dmitry, Ivan's youngest son, believed dead at Uglich a decade earlier, had in fact survived, and that the boy killed in 1591 had been a substitute. Before the pretenders arrived, the famine years themselves had already begun eroding whatever legitimacy Godunov could claim. Grain prices in Moscow reportedly rose to many times their normal level, and Godunov's government, to its credit, attempted relief measures, opening state granaries, organizing public works to give the starving something resembling employment and a claim to charity rather than outright begging, but the scale of the crop failures, driven by summer frosts that destroyed harvests across the realm for 3 consecutive years, overwhelmed any relief effort a government of this era could mount. Reports from the period described roads littered with the bodies of those who had died attempting to reach Moscow in search of food, and it was against this backdrop of mass suffering and a government visibly unable to master the crisis that rumors of a surviving, miraculously preserved Tsarevich found such fertile ground. The first of several men who would come to be known as False Dmitry emerged in 1604, backed by Polish nobles and eventually by an invading Polish-Lithuanian army, claiming to be the miraculously surviving Tsarevich and pressing a claim to the throne that, however fraudulent by most historical assessments, found real traction among a population desperate for a return to what it imagined as legitimate, divinely sanctioned rule. This first pretender actually succeeded in occupying Moscow and ruling briefly as Tsar in 1605 and 1606, before a boyar conspiracy overthrew and killed him, displaying his mutilated body publicly in an effort to convince the population, not entirely successfully, that the impostor was truly dead. A second false Dmitri arose within 2 years, gathering his own army and even his own rival court, and was in turn followed by further claimants and by direct military intervention from both Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, each seeking to install a friendly candidate on the Russian throne or, in the case of the Poles, to occupy the Kremlin outright, which Polish forces did for nearly 2 years beginning in 1610. Godunov died in 1605 amid this crisis, and the following years dissolved into what Russian history remembers as the Time of Troubles, a period of roughly 15 years marked by multiple rival claimants to the throne, foreign occupation of Moscow itself by Polish forces, peasant uprisings led by figures such as Ivan Bolotnikov, and a near-total collapse of central authority that some historians regard as the most severe crisis of legitimacy and governance in the whole of Russian history prior to the 20th century. It was only through the mobilization of a volunteer militia, raised in the merchant city of Nizhny Novgorod and led by the merchant Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, that Polish forces were finally expelled from Moscow in 1612, clearing the way for the Zemsky Sobor that would elect a new Tsar the following year. The human cost of the Time of Troubles is difficult to overstate. Some estimates suggest the combined toll of the famine, the fighting between rival claimants and foreign armies, and the general breakdown of agricultural production and trade across these years killed a significant fraction of the population in the worst affected regions, while whole districts were depopulated as peasants fled toward the frontier or simply died where they stood. It was also during this same turbulent period that the legal restrictions on peasant movement, first sketched out in Ivan's own Sudebnik of 1550, hardened considerably further, as landowners desperate to retain a shrinking labor force pressed for ever tighter controls binding peasants to their estates, a process that would culminate, within a few more decades of the Romanov dynasty's rule, in the fully codified system of serfdom that would define Russian rural life for the better part of the next 3 centuries. It would be an oversimplification to draw a single, unbroken causal line from Ivan's blow in 1581 directly to the chaos of the Time of Troubles a quarter century later, the famine, the ambitions of Polish nobility, and Godunov's own political failures all contributed independently to the crisis, and historians rightly caution against treating complex historical catastrophes as the inevitable product of any single prior event. And yet the underlying structural vulnerability that made the crisis possible traces back with unusual clarity to that one November night. Had the capable Tsarevich lived to inherit the throne as planned, the Rurik line would very likely have continued through a competent ruler with an established claim, rather than passing to an ill-suited younger brother, then to a regent without hereditary legitimacy, and finally into a vacuum that pretenders and foreign armies rushed to fill. In this sense, a great many historians do treat the death of Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich as one of the more consequential single acts of any father in the whole of European royal history. Not the sole cause of the crisis that followed, but the hinge upon which the entire subsequent chain of events swung. The Time of Troubles finally ended in 1613, when a Zemsky Sobor, an assembly larger and more broadly representative than any convened before it, drawing delegates from across the realm's surviving towns and estates in a deliberate effort to grant the new ruler a legitimacy no single faction could contest, elected Mikhail Romanov as Tsar. Mikhail was only 16 years old at his election, and by design. The exhausted boyar factions who dominated the assembly wanted a compromised candidate young and untested enough that no single faction would feel a rival had triumphed over them, and Mikhail's chief qualification, beyond his youth, was his family's connection, through his family's lineage, to Ivan's own beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, whose family name would give the new dynasty its own. The Romanovs would go on to rule Russia for the following 304 years, until the revolutions of 1917 brought that line, too, to its end. It is a strange and quietly resonant fact of history that the dynasty which eventually restored order to Russia after Ivan's line collapsed traced its name and its earliest claim to legitimacy back to the same happy marriage that had, decades earlier, represented the best and most stable years of Ivan the Terrible's own reign, as though the realm, in its exhaustion, reached back past all the terror and chaos of the intervening half-century to the one period of Ivan's rule that everyone could agree had been good. 3 centuries after the blow fell on Aleksandrov Sloboda, the Russian painter Ilya Repin brought the scene back into public consciousness with an 1885 canvas titled, in full, Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan on November 16, 1581. The painting depicts the moment immediately after the blow, Ivan, wild-eyed, cradling his dying son, blood visible at the young man's temple, the old Tsar's face contorted with a horror that seems to combine grief, disbelief, and the dawning recognition of what he has done. It remains one of the most famous and most controversial works in the history of Russian painting. Repin worked on the canvas for roughly 2 years, reportedly experiencing such intense emotional distress during its composition that he was, by his own later account, unable to look directly at the faces he was painting for extended stretches at a time, turning away from the easel between sessions to compose himself before continuing. He used friends and fellow artists as models for both figures, adjusting their features over multiple preparatory studies until he arrived at the specific combination of horror, grief, and dawning realization that the finished work still conveys. The painting's dimensions are considerable, well over 2 meters wide, ensuring that any viewer standing before it in a gallery is confronted with figures rendered close to life-size. An intentional choice on Repin's part meant to erase the comfortable distance a smaller, more decorative historical painting might otherwise provide. Its reception, from the moment of its first exhibition, was intense. Tsar Alexander III, reigning at the time, reportedly found the painting's violence so disturbing that its public exhibition was briefly banned by the Russian government, out of concern for both its graphic content and the uncomfortable parallel it seemed to draw between autocratic power and its capacity for catastrophic, intimate violence. Repin himself later wrote that he had been moved to paint the scene partly in response to a wave of political violence in his own era, using the 4 centuries-old tragedy of the Tsar and his son as a vessel through which to examine violence and its aftermath more broadly, rather than painting the scene purely as a work of historical illustration. In the decades that followed, the painting was physically attacked on more than one occasion by viewers who found its imagery unbearable, most notably in 1913, when a visitor slashed the canvas with a knife, requiring restoration work overseen by Repin himself, who was still alive at the time. These acts of violence against the painting itself speak to something unusual about the image's continued power. Few historical paintings anywhere provoke viewers to physically assault them, and Repin's canvas, across its long history, has drawn exactly that reaction more than once, a strange echo of the very violence it depicts. The historical record received a more forensic form of scrutiny in 1963, when Soviet researchers, as part of a broader program of examining the remains of Russia's medieval and early modern rulers led by the anthropologist and forensic reconstruction specialist Mikhail Gerasimov, opened the tombs of Ivan the Terrible and his son inside the Kremlin's Archangel Cathedral. Gerasimov's team was able, using techniques he had pioneered for reconstructing faces from skeletal remains, to produce a physical reconstruction of Ivan's likely appearance in his final years, revealing a man whose skeleton showed extensive degenerative joint disease and bone growths consistent with a body under severe physical strain, aging him well beyond his 53 years at death. The examination of the Tsarevich's skeleton confirmed the account of a violent blow to the head consistent with the historical descriptions, lending physical, forensic weight to a story that had, until that point, rested entirely on written accounts of varying reliability. The same research program, examining Ivan's own remains, found the elevated mercury and arsenic concentrations mentioned earlier in this story. Concentrations some researchers argue point toward chronic poisoning, whether accidental through medicinal treatment or, as a smaller number of researchers have speculated, deliberate, while other scholars continue to urge caution about drawing firm conclusions from centuries-old skeletal chemistry alone, given how difficult it remains to distinguish gradual medicinal exposure from a single, deliberate poisoning event using bone and hair samples recovered 4 centuries after death. The same 1963 examination also studied the remains of Anastasia, Ivan's first wife, using the more advanced toxicological methods available by the mid-20th century. And it was this analysis that produced the mercury and arsenic findings discussed earlier in her story, findings published decades after the initial exhumation, once the relevant chemical analysis techniques had matured sufficiently to extract reliable data from remains that old. Taken together, the forensic examinations of Ivan, his son, and his first wife represent one of the more thorough scientific investigations ever conducted into the physical remains of a single royal family from this era of Russian history, and they have done more than any written chronicle to settle, at least partially, questions that generations of historians could previously only debate on the basis of hostile or incomplete written testimony. Beyond Repin's canvas, the story of Ivan and his son settled deep into the wider Russian historical and cultural imagination in the centuries that followed, appearing in chronicled histories, in the works of later historians who used Ivan's reign as a case study in the dangers of unchecked autocratic power, and in the folk memory of a court and a capital that had, in its own time, watched the Tsar destroy the one heir capable of carrying his line forward intact. Few single episodes from Russia's medieval and early modern history have retained this particular hold on later imagination, perhaps because it compresses so much of Ivan's entire reign. His genuine achievements, his corrosive paranoia, his capacity for both terror and grief, into a single, comprehensible human moment, a father's hand, a son's fall, and a silence that followed. The question of what exactly happened in that room in November 1581, and why, remains in some respects permanently unresolved, and likely always will. Was it a single, uncharacteristic eruption of temper from a man whose entire life had been shaped by trauma, violence, and the total absence of any check on his own authority? Was it the final, almost inevitable culmination of decades of accumulating rage, guilt, and possibly chemical influence on a mind that had spent a lifetime learning that violence was the only truly effective response to any perceived challenge? Was the specific trigger, a daughter-in-law's clothing, genuinely as trivial as it appears? or a spark that landed on tinder built from years of unresolved political and personal tension between an aging autocrat and the son he had never quite allowed to become his own man? Historians continue to debate these questions, weighing the same fragmentary, often second-hand sources against one another, without ever quite arriving at certainty. What is not in question is the outcome, carried forward through the centuries in Repin's unsettling brushwork and the forensic evidence of a fractured skull examined 400 years after the fact, and in the slow, tangled unraveling of an entire dynasty that followed from one father's hand and one iron-tipped staff. A boy orphaned onto a throne, raised by fear into a man who ruled by fear, built an empire, and then, in a single unguarded moment inside a private chamber, destroyed the one part of his legacy he might have most wanted to preserve. The staff itself was lost long ago, somewhere in the centuries between that winter night and the fall of the dynasty it helped bring about. No inventory of the Kremlin's treasures ever definitively recorded its final resting place, and it may simply have been destroyed, discarded, or quietly forgotten among the countless everyday objects of a court that had far greater treasures to catalog and preserve. But the room remains, in memory if nowhere else, a father on his knees, a son beyond saving, and a silence that would echo, in its consequences, for the better part of 30 years to come, carried forward from a wooden palace at Aleksandrov Sloboda into the fall of a dynasty and the long chaos of an empire left without an heir.